everyone. Wow, how do I even begin? Thank you for coming out. Colonize This, when we did it years ago, we were looking to create a book that we wanted to read, a book that would feed us and nurture us with all the basically the shit we were dealing with every day. And it's amazing that after all these years, it still means so much to people. And it was so important to us to make a new edition for this time where the shit is really hitting the fan, or the AC, whatever. And we wanted to start with thank yous because our gratitude makes us fierce, and our gratitude is what keeps us grounded. And if you're like me and you wake up every morning and listen to the news, you know what it's like to get knocked around, and we are the news, so we're experiencing the news. We don't have to listen to the news to know what the hell's going on. So I just wanted to say some thank yous to all the writers of Colonize This, past and present, to all the readers, to all the people who have passed it on by word of mouth. I think we barely did any readings when it first came out. It just has been all word of mouth. Thank you to my sister, Selita Rehman, who's been with me for so much of it. Thank you to Daisy for inviting me to this journey so many years ago.
She didn't know what she was getting into.
Yeah, we were so young. She was just like, hey, do you want to do this book with me? I was like, yeah, sure. We had so much time. Thank you to Aisha Pandey for paving the way for this new edition to come out, Hachette and Seal. Thank you to DJ Reka for DJing not only this event tonight, but the very first launch for Colonize This, which is amazing. Wow. And all the dances in between that time. But no, it just, looking around, feeling you all, I just want to remember this moment. So I hope that you can also just feel the love, the strength in this room. It's so powerful. Take it with you home, absorb it tonight, and keep it with you for the battle we still have ahead of us. So that's what I'll say. And then
yeah, I want to thank Bushra again. Thank you so much. It has been a long journey. It takes a lot to work on a book like this. Thank you so much to the writers, the ones that are here and the ones that are online somewhere as well. The book would not exist if all these, if not for all these amazing women who sat down, wrote their stories, wrote new versions of their stories when we asked a bunch of questions. It's just, they're incredible. And I want to thank a lot of the women's studies professors, who took this book into their classrooms, for the last 17 years and are going to be taking it into the classrooms. And a special thank you out there to librarians who buy this book, because I have met people who found the book at their public library. And so that is just an incredible, applause for public libraries. They have brought Colonize This into the libraries, and that's just been amazing. I want to thank my university, Miami University in Ohio, because they made it possible for me to work on this book. And thank you to my boo, Frankie Clark, who was helping in the background here. And, when we thought about doing a new edition, I think for both of us, we were really struck by how the social justice movements of the last decade, I would even say more than a decade, have been so led by young women of color, whether it's Black Lives Matter or Standing Rock or organizing undocumented migrant families. Young women of color have been at the forefront of that. And that's part of the reason that we wanted to do a new edition. We wanted to hear these voices who had grown up, who had been leaders in this movement. That felt really important to us. And I think you're going to see that in the new edition of the book. Okay, and I'm going to start off by introducing our first reader, and then they're going to be introducing each other. So we'll be going right one after another. Primera, Sonia, La Sonia who is back there. Sonia Guiñasaca is a queer migrant poet, cultural organizer, and activist from Harlem by way of Ecuador. Named an up-and-coming Latinx poets you need to know by Remezcla. They were the 2017-2018 Artist in Residence at Hemispheric Institute of Performance and Politics, and is a U.S. Future Leaders Delegate for the British Council. Sonia emerged as a national leader in the undocumented migrant artistic and political communities, co-founding and helping to build some of the largest undocumented organizations in the country. And I had the great honor of working with Sonia on their essay, and just thank you so much. It just filled me up and kept me sane over these last 2 years. Thank you. Please come and join us, and let's give them a hand.
How's everyone doing? Good. I would carry the book, but it's so big and thick. It's worth, what you're paying for. I definitely want to start this before I jump into this essay. A big gratitude to Daisy and Bushra who made this book possible. It found its way to me about a decade ago when I was going into college and I was undocumented, and I had to turn to other women of color who made life make sense. So thank you both. Migrant organizing. And just FYI, if you're trying to follow along, I'm going to skip through different sections. This is a linear essay. It's very chronicled of my coming up as a undocumented organizer. So, November 2016. My mother sends me a text. Ganó el Trump. My throat tightens and my chest collapses into an incredible heartache. I am glad she did not call me because I have no idea how to answer, what kind of lies to make up, or what kind of miracles to wish for. I don't want to tell my undocumented mother what this means for our migrant communities. Rewind. I leave Ecuador in 1995, around the same time Tupac is signing to Death Row Records. I migrate at the age of 5 to reunite with my parents in New York City. My dad came before I was born, and my mom a year or two after she gave birth to me. But I wanted to be known that I existed before the migration. I existed in a magical, multi-dimensional way with my parents. In those years before text messages, before Skype and FaceTime, I spoke to my parents on payphones with calling cards. My parents enrolled me in PS 161, where Dominican, Mexican, and Puerto Rican kids were all too familiar with migration. We assimilated into the public school systems. Our names lost the tildes over the ñes. We memorized the Pledge of Allegiance, and we entered linguistic warfare when our Spanish was seen as basic, and we were made to learn and speak proper English. My undocumented status did not come up so much during this time. At home, it was normal to discuss immigration status. We knew that my parents and grandpa and I were waiting for papers. When will our immigration papers come? No one knew. My own immigration status and shaming was not something I had to think about, but I worried for my parents whenever they went to work or when my dad drove around without a license. This became our prayer. Avoid police. Avoid handcuffs, avoid deportation. Algún día, when I was in middle school and given an opportunity to go out of state for a school trip, my parents told me I could not go. I didn't have the identification to get on a plane. So I stayed put in our neighborhood in Harlem. Algún día, they told me. Algún día became 2, 5, 8, 11, 15 years later. In high school, my strict global studies teacher, Mr. Murphy, and English teacher, Ms. Green, introduced me to the Young Lords, the Black Panther, Assata Shakur, Toni Morrison, and many other brilliant Black writers and poets. These readings comforted me as I began to think about college and my future. Here were cultural workers who chronicled their times by weaving stories and critiquing race and class. I will provide for them. Became almost a song on loop in my mind because I wanted to take care of them. It was hard to know that college might not be a reality. High school will be the highlight of your life, my college advisor told me. Saddened and disappointed, but also determined, I started to research my options, and from another undocumented Black migrant, I learned about City College and applied to Hunter College. I was not the only one whose schools and colleges advisors failed them. There were a couple of other students in my school, mostly girls from Jamaica and Nigeria, who were all in similar situations like me. We exchanged scholarship information and we cheered each other on. We set our minds on finding ways to continue our education. While the rest of the senior class worried about prom, fellow undocumented classmates and I were figuring out payments and basic enrollment because we were also the first in our families to be applying to college. Fuck a prom dress and a limo. We were worried about our college application being forwarded to immigration, and consecutively, they're coming to deport our families. Thousands of undocumented students across the country were dealing with the same reality I was in. In 2008, when I attended a Young People's Force Summit in Washington, D.C., I met a migrant organizer named Jennifer, who told me of an undocumented-led New York organization that had just been formed to work to relieve for undocumented young people. She was a young woman of color who was telling me there were more folks like me trying to do something about this bullshit immigration system. And of course, I joined this immigrant organization. And for the next 6 years, I mobilized and organized undocumented youth in New York City. We use social media platforms to coordinate, to come out as undocumented one another, and to build an ecosystem of undocumented organizing and leadership. Imagine our G-chats filled with correspondence about next actions and where to meet and what supplies to bring. We traded Facebook and MySpace messages about legislation and which Senate staffers we had to respond to and organize against. And simultaneously, we left each other messages about fears, love, broken marriages, abortions, latest chisme, and depression. We disrupted borders via the internet. It didn't matter that the mainstream headlines were yet to come. We made digital organizing work for grassroots change. In person, we organized in locations that other established immigrant organizations did not want to associate with, like trailer parks in Alabama. During this time, it was understood that we had power, we could leverage it, and we could influence legislation. Do you know who was at the forefront of all of this? Undocumented queer women of color, femmes and non-binary and gender not-conforming folks. We were black and brown, we were fat and skinny, and in between, we hated those damn caps and gowns, were bilingual, often had strong accents, and worked multiple jobs. We had loud mouths and big personalities. We were introverts and awkward and artists and poets and hijab-wearing messy daters and loyal Converse shoe wearers. We had the occasional bad eyebrows. Not anymore. So contrary to what has been reported, the organizing that has happened among undocumented young people has not been the first movement, nor is it isolated. It has been built on a lineage of resistance from those organizing for queer liberation and black liberation to the sanctuary movements of the 1980s that protected war refugees from Central America. The 2006 immigrant marches especially gave us direction. So no, our movement does not come from foundations, nonprofits, or allies. The work came from our casitas in Texas, Illinois, California, Missouri, and even Maine. This was before organizations. This was before splits and movements and mainstream tokenization. So don't believe the hype that undocumented resistance was built by light-skinned cisgender straight men. Erasure has played a key role in why many of our names go unrecognized. So I'll say them. Tanya, Lisbeth, Maria, Allah, Kemi, Daniela, Razine, Yahaira, Viridiana, Jackie, Teresa, Tam, Cynthia, Reina, and Bambi. Insert our mothers' names here. And many other names that have been erased and mispronounced whenever people have written about undocumented, unapologetic leaders in the history of the immigrant rights movements. The identity and empowerment we had built around the words undocumented and dreamer also began to burn the back of my throat. The mainstream media loved dreamers, but they did not love immigrants or refugees. I am scared to share this, but I admit that I was complicit in creating the good versus bad immigrant narrative. We had debates over caps and gowns and who was more undocumented and who was good for the camera and whose story was more compelling and who was able to prove they were more oppressed and which part of Georgia we could build with and who we would isolate. Meanwhile, I was beginning to realize that my identity was solely built around the lack of status, which meant it was an identity constructed by the US government. Those of us who were artists left political legislative organizing for cultural spaces and cultural strategies. No more reactionary work, no more narrative corrections of what we were not. We wanted to create narratives that illustrated our experiences with nuance. We were more than just the ways we couldn't produce, be productive for economic benefits of this country. We were more than labor. We yearned to feel whole. No more Olympics oppressions. We were done with good immigrant storytelling. We did not want storytellers telling our stories. We were going to write our own damn stories. As I myself begin to identify as a gender non-conforming person, life is becoming more complicated. The feminism that I am moving with is one that honors all genders, that honors fluidity, that honors non-Anglo identification, respects all pronouns, and does not center on pussy power. The feminism that I am moving with now is one that fights for all people and meets people where they are and where they are hurting, and allows them to create a language that suits them well and suits them best. Thank you. There was a part in writing this essay that Daisy said, you know, just be honest. And there was a line about like being complicit about recreating this like good versus bad immigrant narratives. And Daisy was like, just write it and say that you are like scared and you are afraid and you are like ashamed of naming that, because we tend to like perform ourselves as like arriving to a political consciousness. But many of us, we have come from like a young age. Like this whole education system is fucked up, right? So we don't know these things. And when we do, I think there's this just like sentiment of shaming each other in our learnings. And so that was for younger Sonia, and also for many of us who are still finding ourselves in our political consciousness and our connection to movements. So with that said, there's so many amazing readers coming up, and I was so excited to bring up Selita Copeland, who was also a Harlem-born writer. So shout outs to Harlem. Her poem, Pregnant with Haiti's Prayer, won the Best of the Bronx in the 2010 Random House Creative Writing Contest. She has also participated in the National Council of Teachers of English in 2015. And now lives in the Bronx, and is part of a Go the Bronx. The Bronx doesn't get love, y'all. Saida is part of a writing group of women dedicated to bringing awareness to culture and spiritual consciousness. And she's currently working on creating her own very own journal line in hopes of encouraging people to fall in love with writing like she has. So a big warm applause to Saida.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Thank you so much for coming out. I just want to give a huge, huge thank you to our editors, Daisy and Bushra, for just allowing me to be a part of this project. I'm so humble. Thank you. So the title of my essay is Echoes of a Mother, and I'll begin. I had many mothers. There were many women who molded themselves into the position. Some taught me what was needed in different seasons of my life, while others taught me other things and took on the role as a full-time job. My biological mother was 31 years old when she gave birth to me. I was her fourth child. She struggled with an addiction to crack. At the age of 1, I was placed in my mother's only sister care in New York, while my siblings were placed in the care of my great-grandmother who lived in South Carolina. Rumor has it that the day the courts decided to separate my siblings and me from my mother, she threw her body on the courtroom floor, pleading to the judge to allow me to stay in the city. I was her youngest child at the time. She couldn't handle having all of her children taken away. The judge agreed. Regardless of the court's warnings, my aunt allowed my mother to visit me whenever she pleased. My mother was the kind of woman who had no filter on her thoughts or words. She said how she felt with no apologies, and her presence demanded respect. My mother and aunt lived in Harlem, not far away from one another. I remember actually living with my mother for short periods of time, but it was only a few weeks at a time, And eventually they would end up in arguments between my aunt and my mother about my mother not returning me. I remember hiding quietly in bathrooms, doors locked, lights off, to make my aunt believe no one was home. I knew at a young age that I wanted to be with the woman who birthed me, and I didn't understand why I couldn't. During one of my visits with my mother, my aunt allowed my cousins to come over to play with me. I wanted to buy all of us candy. I thought it was a brilliant idea to find money by searching my mother's coat pockets. I ran to her walk-in closet and moved knitted and cotton sweaters out of my face as I jammed my small hands into each pocket. Fishing for any forgotten quarters, nickels, or dimes, I found a handful of change in one coat. Feeling lucky, I reached my hand into the next coat, and something that felt like a pin greeted my fingers. I pulled it out, examined its glass texture, and placed it on my lips. My cheeks filled with air, and I blew with all of my might until it's whole. This strange item didn't make a sound, so I knew it wasn't a whistle. I had never seen anything like it and felt it was something I should not be playing with. So I returned it to its pocket and closed the closet door. Later that night, while I was still at my mother's apartment, I woke to my mother sitting on the edge of the bed. She had the funny object I found earlier in her mouth. I watched as her thumb scratched the lighter until its flame appeared. She coughed hard and then looked over at me as I began to stare. "Go to sleep, Mama," she cooed. My mother's voice was low and raspy from the smoke exiting her mouth. I peeled the sheets back and climbed over the mountain of blankets to her. I sat beside her and laid my head on her lap. Her body trembled as she brought the funny object to her lips again. I sat up, waited for her next inhale, and reached up to knock the glass pipe out of her hand. "Don't you ever do no shit like that again. Do you hear me?" she hissed, and jumped up to catch the glass pipe before it could hit the floor. I dozed off that night, as the smell of crack, a smell that resembled plastic burning, rocked me back to sleep. I never tried to stop her again. Her addiction never changed her love for me or my siblings. I grew to understand that this addiction forced her to make decisions that she would have never had made in a sober mindset. It was crack that kept my mother from being the best mother I knew she could be. Eventually, my mother's drug use continuing and my aunt allowing me to visit her without the permission of Child Protective Services came to light. I was placed in foster care again, outside of my family this time. My new foster family was a couple who lived in St. Albans, Queens. They were in their early 70s. My foster mother's name was Louise, but I called her Mama, and her husband, Papa. She woke up one morning very early. I would have thought that it was time for church service by the way she had ironed a new dress for me and laid it out on a guest room bed. We drove to the courthouse as butterflies beat against my 10-year-old ribcage. I wanted them to ask me for the 100th time who I wanted to live with. And for the 100th time, I was ready to say my mother. Due to my age, I was not allowed in the courtroom. Mama waited for me on the wooden benches outside. My mother spoke with me briefly before going inside. No more than 10 minutes later, she emerged. I searched her face for some kind of emotion, sadness, anger, happiness, but it was blank. I ran to her, hugging her waist, feeling confident I'll be going home. "Mommy, what did they say?" I was now holding her hand, looking at the mold that rested in its center. "Oh, they took my rights away," she said so nonchalantly as if discussing the weather. She swatted the air and sucked her teeth. "Does that mean you're not my mommy anymore?" "No. It means on paper I can't take care of you. They can never take me away from you away from my heart. On earth, or even when I'm gone, I will always be your mother." Unlike my mother, I was not able to hold back my tears. I felt defeated. I wondered on that ride back to Queens if she had argued for me. Did she fight hard enough for me? Did she really want me? Sweetie? Sweetie. The nurse's voice sounded like a faint song in my ear. My mind was racing, trying to recall what or who I was going to go to. I'm sorry, what are prenatal pills again? I carefully pronounced the new word. Prenatal pills are what you're going to start taking. They're for your child's development. Child? My eyes darted across the room, taking in the 2 signs encouraging mothers to breastfeed. Oh, darling, your test came back positive. You're pregnant. The nurse smile was the opposite of the emotions flooding my body. She must have noticed my lack of excitement and instantly offered her services. I can tell your mother for you if you like. Many girls ask that, so you don't have to tell her the news on your own. I understand how hard it can be. She continued to fill out the prescription paper and placed it in my trembling hand. I gazed out at the window at the large lake that hugged the college campus. I began to wonder how long it would take for me to walk directly into that lake and disappear. If I did, I wouldn't have to worry about this budding life inside of me. You can't tell her. The tears are now diving off the cliff of my chin. My mother wouldn't understand. She couldn't understand. I could place her on speakerphone if you like, to make it easier. My mother is dead. My voice didn't sound like my own. Those words felt like a lie. They were the truth. Darling, I'm so sorry. Okay, well, let's tell your father, and I'm here if you need me. She handed me a box of tissue. No, he's dead too. I'm so sorry. Who do you have as a support system? Her face filled with pity, more than sadness. I often ask myself the same question. I explained to the nurse that I had been late running to campus for my sophomore year because my siblings and I had just buried my mother. My mother had fought a good fight against lung cancer. There was no calling to relay the good news because despite of her death, that's exactly what it was, good news. My mother believed that children were blessings from God, and to lose a child, like she did to the system, was shameful. The other person I could talk to, besides my child's father, was my adoptive father. After Mama passed, Papa moved down south, and I had been adopted by a Jamaican couple who had 3 biological sons of their own. I struggled with being adopted. I felt displaced and many times unwanted. It was not easy, and I had formed a strong bond with my adoptive father. So over the phone, I told him that I was pregnant. I was too afraid to tell him in person. He asked me if I was joking. After realizing this wasn't one of my pranks, he asked me how far along was I. When I told him, he cleared his throat, told me he had some errands to run, and hung up the phone. When I told my child's father about my pregnancy, his first words were, "You know what to do." He didn't even ask me if I wanted to keep the baby. He couldn't bring himself to say the word abortion. After a long pause, he assured me that he would be there and agree with my decision if I decided to keep the baby. I struggled with the idea of how my life would change either way, whether I decided to keep the child or if I decided not to. I sought advice from the campus therapist. I began seeing her before I found out I was pregnant because of my mother's passing. "You are such a bright girl. You have to do what's right for you," she said. "I'm just torn. I'm getting bigger. I'm tired these days. I hate going to class because morning sickness is kicking my ass. I don't have any energy." Her raised, penciled eyebrows made it look like she was fighting sleep. "Are you keeping it?" This question had not been asked out loud, though I had been asking it over and over in my head. I don't know. It doesn't feel real. There were so many factors to consider: my financial stability, support system, shelter, my religious beliefs, my education. "I live near a Planned Parenthood. I can make an appointment for you. Then after everything is done, we can rest at my house and relax," she said. I imagined waiting at the Planned Parenthood, nervously wondering if everyone knew that I was about to have an abortion. "You can stay in my daughter's room," she offered. "We return to campus Sunday. You'll have time to relax and heal. Just think about it." The therapist smiled and handed me her card. She told me to email her or call her after I made my decision. The reactions of my adoptive father and my boyfriend angered me. These men did not know what it meant to be a woman. They did not understand that there were not just a couple of quick fixes. My adoptive father was angry that I was pregnant and not married. He was pro-life and expected me to have the child, yet he was upset that it was not the right timing because I still needed to complete college. There was no such thing as the right time to have a child. My therapist understood that. Her offering me Planned Parenthood services as an option showed me that I didn't have to keep my child because I felt that I had been religiously raised. However, I didn't agree with how she made the procedure sound like a walk in the park. For women of color, specifically, to decide to exercise the right of having an abortion is much more complicated than that. There are factors as to why abortion is not talked about in the African American community. Religion plays a role because some consider it a sin to terminate a pregnancy. In some cases, an additional child can be financially straining, yet Black women are expected to be able to handle the burden. The history of women of color and abortion is associated with the history of slavery. Black women were forced in many cases to conceive and then watch their children be sold off or killed. Adoption was viewed in the same light. To willingly give up your child as a woman of color means to be shunned. This therapist did not know what it felt like to be a 19-year-old Black woman, but she knew that I had choices and that I needed to be aware of them. This journey taught me that it was not about who is judging you. It is about knowing your rights and making a decision and being comfortable with it. I learned that Planned Parenthood offered me a variety of services. It also supported me if I didn't want to go through with the abortion. In the end, my therapist showed me that owning my feminism meant exercising my right to do as I wish with my body, with no apologies. I eventually finished my semester and moved into the shelter where I was 4 months pregnant. When I reached 7 months, I found my first apartment right after my 20th birthday. The night before I was going to give birth, I could not sleep. I paced back and forth in my living room to ease the contractions. It became hard to stand, so I tried crawling, hoping that it would help. When all else failed, I found myself bouncing up and down on my pink exercise ball and repenting to God for ever having sex. I called my aunt, and she told me I should head to the emergency room. And I was so nervous, but I knew it was definitely time. My boyfriend and I checked into the hospital around 2 a.m. I was dilated 5 centimeters, enough to be admitted. I was wheeled into different rooms and hooked up to machines that monitored my baby's heartbeat. The beating sounds disturbed me at first because they brought back memories of how my mother's hospital machines used to sound. The bright lights, the huge rooms, the various nurses, and all the introductions frightened me. I felt like a little girl again. I felt scared and I wanted my mother. The following afternoon, I felt pressure in my lower abdomen and back. I thought it meant that I had to use the bathroom. But nurses quickly filled my room and informed me it was time to push. The epidural I've had hours prior to that was not much relief. I was very emotional, telling my boyfriend that I didn't want to push. I didn't want to have a baby anymore because of the pain. One nurse held my hand and said, "We could be here pushing for half an hour or for the next 3 hours. It's your choice." When I heard those words, I held my breath and pushed with all my might. My sister, my boyfriend, and the doctor and nurses encouraged me, telling me that they could see a little baby's head. Later, I learned that they really didn't see a head. They were just trying to get over. I pushed 5 times, and the 5th time, my son, covered in my blood, entered the world with the softest cry I've ever heard. They placed his warm, slippery body on my chest. I looked down at him and through my teary eyes, careful not to let him slip out my arms as our cries merged into one another's. In that moment, I could not imagine ever leaving him or making him feel that I at once felt like I couldn't be his mother. I knew my job was to always let him know I loved him and most importantly, that I wanted him. When I was finally moved to the visitor's room with my son, everything felt surreal. I stared at myself in the bathroom mirror, observing my hospital gown, which has fallen off of my shoulder. My eyes were bloodshot from pushing. I looked as if I had been deprived of sleep for weeks. My sister and boyfriend had left to get food. I changed my son's clothes and held him in my arms. As I laid him down, I heard a voice that sounded like my mother's. The voice sounded close, as if it was coming from the chair next to my bedside. So, you had the baby. The voice was so familiar, like an old song you cannot forget. My eyes searched the room. No one was beside me. No one was there besides me and my son. Yes, Mommy, I did. I had him. I answered back, staring at the empty leather chair. Just then, my boyfriend walked into the room and had our dinner. I expressed to him I had just spoken to my mother and that she had came to visit me. He kissed my forehead and said the medicine was probably still making its way out of me. I knew it was not the medicine. I felt closure at that moment, as short and beautiful as it was. I believe that it was a spiritual moment with my mother, her letting me know that she was there by my side the whole time. I had made the right decision in having my son. I learned to listen to my own voice, and I learned of the options available to me as a woman in this journey. The birth of my son changed the way that I viewed and understood the strength of women. I'm grateful to my mother and for all the women who have been in my life and took on her role. I learned so much from my mother, both things that I want to do as a mother and things that I would change. Motherhood is a journey that no one can prepare you for. In the end, I gave birth to a beautiful, healthy baby boy. I know my mother would be proud of him if she was here today. Thank you. And thank you, everyone. That story was hard to tell, but Daisy and Busha, you guys pushed me. And this is the second baby boy. So I'm just so excited to just be able to share that with you guys, and I thank you so much for listening. The next person who's coming up to share with us is beautiful Jamila King. She's a journalist who writes about race and Amber? Oh, it's Amber. Sorry. It's going to be Amber. Jamila, you're still beautiful. Amber Taylor is a beautiful poet and a writer from the Midwest. She currently lives in Columbus, Ohio, where she works as a pharmacy technician by day and writes about race, gender, and sexuality by night. Let's give her a big round of applause.
Oh God, this is a little, how do you adjust this? Oh, this is nice. Okay, wow, there's a lot of people in here. Oh yeah, that's really tall. Okay. I don't think I can manage to hold it. I'm so nervous. Thank you, Daisy, and thank you, Bushra. I guess I'll just go ahead and start reading. My essay is called Tender-Headed Before, During, and After Obama. I'm just going to read a few. Yeah, I know. I was like that one girl who like cried every time she had to get her hair done. It was awful. But anyways, I'm just going to read about half of it. You are more sensitive than most, so you cry over silly things. You're very young when you see a white Jesus being crucified on the television in your basement, and you cry for him because you don't think your soul is worth redeeming if it means wearing a crown of thorns. You're 9 when you cry at Michael Jackson's Thriller music video. You like to watch it in the daytime with your sister, but when it's time for bed, you think zombie Michael Jackson will come for you, so you stay awake all night. You're a little older when you cry when there are bees in the backyard and they chase you into the house. You're in your teens when you cry at a commercial for the first time. An ad for the 2012 Winter Olympics plays on YouTube, and you sob alone in your living room couch for 5 minutes before you can start watching a Michelle Phan video. You're in college when you see a commercial for a Trident gum commercial on television and burst into tears in front of your grandma who asks, "What the hell is wrong with you?" You lie and you say you don't know, even though you thought it was sweet how the father in the commercial saved all the gum wrapper cranes he made for his daughter until she went to college. Your problem is that you don't cry when you actually need to. You don't cry when something really awful happens, because the really awful things that keep happening have happened before, and they will continue to happen. Your body tires of crying over the same thing. You build a wall for yourself to hide behind, and you don't try to process the pain. You don't think you're meant to cry this much. But if you are, then you wish that God could have at least made you less tender-headed. You do not cry when racial violence comes to your dorm room, when you're with your white roommate squinting up at the little television when the news says Darren Wilson will not be indicted. Michael Brown's body that lay in the street for 4 hours after being slaughtered can be your body next, and more easily the body of your partner or any of your 8 male cousins. You do not cry when your roommate looks at you and says that if you ever have a family of your own in the future, you must leave the country with them so that this place doesn't kill you all. They will kill you, she says, and they will not care. The morning after the election, you call your father before your first class. Some people aren't going to their classes today. Maybe I shouldn't either, you say. You're in the bathroom, leaning over the sink, applying lipstick. Brown, a few shades darker than your own skin. Your phone buzzes frantically on the toilet seat with notifications from the Black People Meet at Miami group chat. Your father's voice barks through the speaker. That's weak shit, Amber. Don't come to me with that weak shit. They're scared. They shouldn't be, and neither should you. Forget these white people. Go to your classes and do what you went there to do. Get your degree and get the hell out. You are 18 years old when you go to Disney World with your high school marching band. On the last day of your trip, your mother meets you in the Magic Kingdom, and you go to meet Princess Tiana together. In line, you notice a little black girl in front of you, who is also Tiana in her green water lily dress. You smile at her and tell her how lucky she is to have a Disney princess to look up to while she is still young. All you had in your childhood was Pocahontas, Jasmine, and Mulan, all of whom you clung to for empowerment, but none of them made you feel worth much as a black girl. Little Tiana smiles at you without understanding and gives you a twirl in her dress. Princess Tiana does for you what the Obamas did. They help you to see your black self in what you think is a good way, though neither of them do more for you than that. Neither of them make the racism go away. You go with your mother to a store in the Magic Kingdom that sits next to Cinderella's castle. It is a store that only sells Disney princess merchandise. You go because you want to buy a Tiana doll. The store is stocked with dresses, tiaras, wands, dolls, and toys for all the white princesses, plus Tinkerbell, who is not a princess at all. You are told that you must walk to the far end of the park to Dumbo Circus, which is where they keep the black doll. The little white girls and their mothers look at you and your mother like you're deranged. Some of them are scared of you and your tears. They move out of your way when you check every shelf of the store for the 5th time. You curse at their confusion. Why the fuck do they have a Tinkerbell and a fucking princess store, but they don't even have Tiana? What you mean to say is, why the fuck did they erase me? You are 13, you are restless, and you feel like crying, but the tears won't come because you prefer to hold them back until you're certain the pain is over. You roll over in bed and stare at the ceiling until the darkness starts to make dots of color in your vision. You stare until the colors start to shift and turn like your stomach. You ask yourself, I'm alive to see the first black president of this country. Shouldn't I be more moved than this? Your heart recoils and your chest feels hollow. You give yourself a headache thinking about your new but unchanged reality. Or perhaps the braids in your hair are just too tight. The sun sets on Disney World. You drag your feet back to Cinderella's castle with your mother. You hug your toddler Tiana doll, feeling embarrassed. You apologized for making a scene in the store earlier. It's okay, Amber. How was that okay? Didn't I embarrass you? I felt bad for you, Amber, because you realized that life just isn't fair. Okay, and that's it. Okay, so I realize now that that probably didn't make too much sense, but it does if you read it. If you read all of it. Anyway, the next reader coming up is Alma Sade. Alma Sade is an anti-poverty advocate, organizer, policy nerd, lawyer, and writer based in Los Angeles. Almaz is the deputy director at the California Immigrant Policy Center. Her family is still in the Midwest. So yay! Yay, Almaz!
Thanks, Amber. Hi, guys. How are you? Are you okay? Yeah, I can understand. You're like all eyes on you, right? Daisy and Bushra. So I am the first writer up from the original crew. The book is 19 years old. Daisy and Bushra. Where's Daisy? Hi. This is old people's privilege. You've impacted the movement in ways that are really hard to describe on stage in 5 seconds. They require their own books, their own poems, and their own events. In Arabic, Bushra is often translated as good news. And both Daisy and Bushra bring a lot. It's also my mom's name. And she's awesome. We hope you do it again, editions 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. The book is evidence of the power of movement. I wrote this piece 19 years ago. I was really dumb. But in reading it, I realized some important things remain, even though lots of things are different. Chuppels and gym shorts, an Indian Muslim woman in the land of Oz. It was finals week during the spring semester of my sophomore year at the University of Kansas, and I was buried under mounds of papers and exams. The stress was exacerbated by long nights, too much coffee, and a chronic building pain in my permanently splintered and cracked shins. I still have this, and left over from an old sports injury. My schedule was not exactly permitting much downtime, and I was regretting my decision to pursue work in 3 departments. I was grasping to hold on to what little sanity I had left. Wasn't living in Kansas supposed to be way more laid back than this? After all, Kansas was the portal of the magical land of Oz, where wicked people melted when doused with mop water, and bright red, sparkly shoes could substitute for the services of American Airlines, providing a quick getaway. Storybook tales aside, the physical reality of this period was that my deadlines were inescapable. Moreover, the most pressing of these deadlines was completely non-school related. My dad, on his way home, our home, to Wichita, was coming for a brief visit. This would be his first day by himself, without my mom to accompany him or act as a buffer. Dad visited me the night before my most difficult exam, having just returned from spending time with his own family, a group of people with whom he historically had an antagonistic and difficult relationship. Dad seemed particularly relaxed into his stocky 6'4" frame. Wearing one of the more subtle of his 19 cowboy hats, he arrived at my door, hungry, greeting me in Urdu, our mother tongue, and laden with gifts from Estee Lauder. Never mind that I rarely wore makeup and would have preferred to see the money spent on my electric bill or books. If Dad's visit was going to include a conversation about how little I use beauty products, I was not going to be receptive. Almas, began my father from across the dinner table, he still calls me that, speaking in his British Indian accent infused with his love of Midwestern colloquialisms. You know, I don't do his accent, but you won't be a spring chicken forever. While I was in Philadelphia, I realized how important it is for you to start thinking about our culture, our religion, and your future marriage plans. I think it's time we begin a 2-year marriage plan for you so we can find you a husband and start a family. I think 22 will be a good age for you. I needed to what? I needed to begin thinking about the importance of tradition and be married by 22. This, from the only Indian man I knew who had Alabama's first album on vinyl and loved to spend long weekends in his rickety old camper near Cheney Lake, bass fishing and listening to traditional Qawwali music. My father, in fact, in his youth, had been crowned Mr. Madras, weightlifting champion 1965. Yeah, and had left India to be an American cowboy in his spare time. But he wanted me to aspire to be a spring chicken, maintaining some unseen hearth and home to reflect my commitment to tradition, culture, and family. Dad continued, I have met a boy that I like for you very much, Masood's son, Mahmoud. We should be able to arrange something, and I think you'll be very happy. Masood, Dad's cousin. That would make me and Mahmoud distant relatives of some sort, and Dad wants to arrange something. I had brief visions of being paraded around a room, serving tea to strangers in a sari or a shalwar kameez, wearing a long braid and chappals, while Dad boasted of my domestic capabilities to increase my attractiveness to potential suitors. I quickly flipped through my mental Rolodex of rhetorical devices acquired during years of women's studies classes and found the card super blank. No doubt even Catherine McKinnon would have been rendered speechless sitting across the table from my dad. It is not that I hadn't already dealt with this issue. In fact, we had been here before a lot, ever since the marriage proposals began when I was 14. Of course, when they began, they were a joke. The jokes were always, however, were always at my expense. You received a proposal from a nice boy. He is studying engineering, my father would tell me with a huge playful grin. But I told him that you weren't interested because you're too busy with school and you can't clean or cook. Dad's marriage propositions also resembled conversations that we had already had about my relationship to Islamic practices specific to women. Some negotiated in my favor, and others simply shelved for the time being. A year ago, Dad had come to me while I was home for the holidays, asking me to begin to wear a hijab. I categorically refused, maintaining respect for those women who chose to do so. I understood that for numerous women, as well as for Dad, hijab symbolized something much more than covering a woman's body or hair. It symbolized a way to adhere to religious and cultural tradition in order to prevent complete Western immersion. But even my understanding of this concern didn't change my feeling toward hijab. Negotiating certain issues had always been a part of the dynamic between my parents and me. It wasn't that I disagreed with them about everything. In fact, I had internalized much of the Islamic perspective of the female body while simultaneously admitting to its problematic nature. To this day, I would rather wear a wool sweater than a bathing suit in public. Really true. No matter how sweltering the weather. Moreover, Islam became an important part of differentiating myself from other American kids who did not have to find a balance between two opposing cultures. By the time I hit adolescence, I had already established myself outside of the social norm, especially of the women in my own community. I was an athletic teenager, a competitive athlete, and a budding weightlifter. After a lot of reasoning with my parents, I was permitted to wear shorts to compete in tennis tournaments, but I was not allowed to show my legs or arms. No tank tops outside of sports. It was a big deal for my parents to have agreed to allow me to wear shorts in the first place. The small community of South Asian Muslim girls my age growing up in Kansas became symbols of the future of our community in the United States. South Asian girls in my community were expected to embody the values of a pre-existing social structure. We were scrutinized for what we said and for what we wore, for being seen with boys in public, and for lacking grace and piety. Needless to say, because of disproportionate muscle mass, crooked teeth, huge Lucy glasses, and a disposition to walk pigeon-toed, I was not among the favored. To add insult to injury, my mom nicknamed me Amazon Woman, lamenting the fact that she, a beautiful petite lady, had produced such a graceless, unfeminine creature. I'm sorry. I was the snot-nosed younger sibling of the Bollywood princess my mother had in mind. As a more appropriate representation of an Indian daughter, I loved sports and books. I hated painful makeup rituals and tight jewelry. It wasn't that I had a feminist awakening at an early age. I was really just an obnoxious kid who did not understand the politics raging around my body. By positioning me as a subject of both humiliation and negotiation, Mom and Dad had inadvertently laid the foundation for me to understand and scrutinize the process of conditioning women to fulfill particular social obligations. What was different about my conversation with Dad that night was the sense of immediacy, the sense of detail. Somehow, discussion about a 2-year marriage plan seemed to encroach on my personal space, much more than had previous jokes about my inability to complete household chores or pressure to begin wearing a hijab. I recognized that the threat was not as extreme as being shipped off to India in order to marry someone I had never met. The challenge was far more subtle than this. I was being asked to choose my community. There was no way to tell my dad about my complicated reality. Certain characteristics of my current life had already indicated failure by their standards. I was involved in a long-term relationship with a white man whose father was a prison guard on death row, an occupation that would have mortified my parents. I was also struggling with an insurmountable crush on an actress in the theater and film department. I was debating my sexuality in terms of cultural compatibility as well as gender. Many of my closest friends, including my roommates, were coming to terms with their own life choices, having recently come out of the closet but unable to tell their families about their decisions. I felt inextricably linked to this group of women who, like me, often had to lead double lives. Although I had no tools to answer my father that night at dinner, feminist theory had provided me with the tools to understand why my father and I were engaged in this conversation in the first place. I understood that in his mind, Dad was fulfilling his social obligation as father and protector. He worried about my economic stability and, in a roundabout way, my happiness. At the same time, growing up in Kansas and coming to feminism in Kansas meant that I had to reconcile a number of different issues. I'm a Muslim first-generation Indian feminist woman studying in a largely homogenous white Christian community in Midwestern America. What sacrifices are necessary for me to retain my familiar relationships, as well as a sense of personal autonomy informed by the feminism I had come to know? Despite having grown up in the Bible Belt, it is difficult for me to relate to stories told by my closest friends of being raised on cattle ranches and farms, growing up in Christian by default, and experiencing the strict social norms of small religious communities in rural Kansas. Given the context of this community, a predominantly white, middle-aged college town, I have difficulty explaining that my feminism has to address things like I should be able to wear both hijab and shorts if I choose to. To reconcile the differences between my own priorities and those of the women I had come to work with, know, study with, I had to learn to bridge the gap between the feminist canon of Western white women and my own experiences as a first-generation Indian Muslim woman living in the Midwest. I continue to struggle, with issues like cultural differences, colonialism, Islam, and feminism, and how they relate to one another. There are a few guidebooks for women like me who are trying to negotiate the paradigm of feminism in two different worlds. There's a delicate dance that I must master, a dance of negotiating identity within interlinking cultural spheres that has a clear political bent and purpose. This has forced me to change my frame of reference, developing from a rebellious tomboy who resisted parental imposition to a budding social critic, learning how to be a committed feminist and still keep my cultural, religious, and community ties. As for family, we still negotiate, despite the fact that Dad's 2-year marriage plan has turned into a 19-year plan. The original line has yet to come to fruition in this 22nd year. We're still there. That's the piece. Thank you. I have the great privilege of welcoming Sandra Kamwang to the stage. But before I do that, I would be remiss. My best friend in the universe traveled 300 miles to be here, and she's in the back of the room. Thank you, Jess. I love you so much. Sandra Kamwang is a daughter of Thai immigrants hailing from Flushing, Queens. That's where I'm from. I mean, I'm from Kansas, but like originally Queens. She is a proud CUNY alum with a Bachelor's of Arts in Sociology, having also studied Asian American Studies and Biology. She cares deeply about the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and class and health disparities, and aims to become a compassionate care provider. As a healer, she wishes to connect more deeply with her Mon Theo Chao Thai heritage and uplift the Southeast Asian community in all of her work. Where's Sandra? Oh.
Hello. Hi. Oh my gosh. Okay. Did everyone eat yet? Is everyone okay? Hello. Thank you. Thank you so much. I guess the first thing I want to do is thank Daisy and thank Bushra so much. I don't know what compelled y'all to let a 19-year-old write for your book. So I just want to thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to do this, to represent my family. And also, oh my God, I'm already crying. This is horrible. And also thank you to my friends and my family here, my chosen family. I love you guys. Becoming an abortion doula. The sun could fall on top of my mother, and she would hold it up with her bare palms with no issue. Once a man in a convertible cut her off, and she rolled down the window, yelled at him in Thai, and then threw her travel mug into his white leather seats. Having a mother who's a million times a person I could ever strive to be means that my existence, my breath, and my work has her voice in it as well. We kids always laughed in the back seat of our Honda Pilot, a picture of Buddha hanging from our rear view mirror, as our mother drove us back and forth between school, music lessons, and tutoring. What a superwoman. Rising to the top of her class in business school at the age of 17, working 2 jobs and learning just how lonely the busiest city in the world can be. Mom, do you wish that there were 3 kids in the back instead of 2? After I became an intern and then an abortion doula for the Planned Parenthood of New York City, my mother revealed to me a secret she held dearly for a long time. I've never expected her to say the words that 1 in 3 women can say. I've had an abortion. My mother must have dragged her tired, betraying body to the living room where my father camped out. Her experience is not unheard of. They hadn't slept in the same room for more than 10 times since I was born. She told him the news only to hear something along the line of, "We don't want another child. We can't have one. Get rid of it." His words were always final and demanding. Mom, I wish I had been older. I wish I could have talked you through it like I do with strangers. My mother is a logical woman. When she found out she was pregnant again, I'm almost positive she thought about all the baby clothes she kept and how she could reuse them. She dressed my brother and me both up in pink and blue because clothes were clothes. And then she must have thought about how I nursed Lenny's bruises when Dad hit him too hard, or when I let his fist land on me instead, running in at just the right time. She must have thought about how she'd never bring another child into this broken glass life. Me crying on the banister, avoiding blood on the beige carpet. The muffled sound of John Wayne in the eerie silence after a fight, the holes in the cream walls and the ripped curtains. My mother had a procedure done in an OBGYN office, much different from the health centers where I volunteer at. She sat alone in a waiting room with pictures of 2 pairs of hands over a swollen belly on the walls. There are so many traumatizing images that can come up before a procedure that doulas need to be aware of. A patient could be more upset about the pictures in the waiting room or the picketers outside than the pain from the actual procedure. I found that after I introduced myself and helped to get a patient change, it's not uncommon for a patient to mention these emotional triggers. As a doula, it's my job to listen and hold a space of vulnerability for them. My mother must have cried so much when she changed into a blue gown and put her feet up into the cold stirrups. Did the nurse hold your hand? Did she tell you you were brave and strong? I'm sure those words sounded better in our mother tongue. Did they offer you a translator? The nurses at Planned Parenthood can administer medication, set up the monitors, and wipe away tears all at once. But at other clinics or hospitals, they can be as pro-life as the people spitting and praying outside. It's delusional to think that all medical providers are pro-choice, much less advocates of reproductive justice. I would have reminded my mother to tuck in her chin to her chest, take slow, deep breaths, to concentrate on relaxing the muscles in her bottom and her belly. I would have held her hand in mine, and put another on her shoulder after asking if it was okay. I would tell her she was brave, strong, and safe. Mom, I see you in every patient I meet. I see you in the 15-year-olds who have never had a pelvic exam, and the 50-year-olds with 3 grandsons, and the 30-year-olds who sometimes forget to take her pill. Abortion stories are not one size fits all. From the curly-haired woman who went home with her less than perfect boyfriend to the trans man who just needed me to remind him to breathe slowly, every single patient is so different. Thinking in terms of reproductive justice means respecting the choices that people make, whether or not they fit into your own paradigm, because there's a lifetime experience that is hidden. Many people walk out of the clinic back into abusive homes or are returning for their 4th abortion. Sometimes the only thing a doula can do is make sure that a patient has all the resources that they need and be the one non-judgmental person in their life at the moment. There are women of every color fighting for the right to terminate a pregnancy, and it's critical to acknowledge that grassroots movements that continue to birth leaders with strong hands and steel voices. Still, there is so much work to be done, even the most radical of movements. The world of reproductive health activism is still a field dominated by white women. Teaching white women about reproductive justice is not enough. The change will come when the room is full of people of all backgrounds. Being a doula is a privilege, and the knowledge and experience that has given me my voice are privileges. I'm dedicating my life to uplifting the next daughter who learned first aid from putting Band-Aids on her mom so that she would never have to see abortions, healthcare, or activism as unreachable. Learning about reproductive justice has given me a framework for understanding my work and the change that I want to make in a way that doesn't require me to sacrifice my identity. My presence as an Asian American woman has made a difference in the procedure room as well as the political battlefield. I am from a culture that does not discuss puberty, much less abortion. There is something very powerful about holding space, especially for another woman of color. To have an ideology and to be able to contribute to a cause I believe in is empowering. And at a time when all that can go wrong might go wrong, all I can do is hope that the hands of held find the strength to continue and fight as well. To my mother, thank you for molding me into the warrior that I am. Thank you for giving me your hands, soft and callous. Thank you for giving me your anger and your relentless kindness. Thank you. Thank you so much. I wrote this because I know a lot of survivors who don't talk about what they go through when they're surviving, when in the process of it. So if you're out there, I wrote it for you. Shifting gears, I'm so honored to introduce Taji Smith, who is a full-time journalist, who has been a full-time journalist for more than 2 decades. She's an award-winning television producer, writer, and mother. Her essays on race and gentrification have been published in numerous literary anthologies. Taji was a television journalist at CBS News for 23 years and now works as a producer for ABC News in New York. Give her a hand.
Hello, everyone. 18 years ago, I didn't have to wear these. You too will wear these. Jeanette, thank you for coming. Daisy, Bushra, thank you for reissuing this book once again. And actually saw Keene in the audience, one of our original authors. There she is, so shout outs. All right, I'm gonna get started. You know, this piece is about gentrification, and I can't believe I was writing about it almost 2 decades ago. The mission, and so you know, it's just as pertinent today as it was 18 years ago. So I will read a portion of my piece, What Happens When Your Hood is the Last Stop on the White Flight Express. Okay. Let me see. Bear with me. Gentrification, the displacement of poor women and people of color, the raising of rents and the eradication of single, poor, and working class women from neighborhoods once considered unsavory by people who did not live there. The demolition of housing projects, a money-driven process in which landowners and developers push people, in this case, many of them single mothers, out of their homes without thinking about where they will go. Gentrification is a premeditated process in which an imaginary bleach is poured on a community, and the only remaining color left in that community is white. Only the strong colored survived. I know I'm using the word colored. Now, this was about the mission. The word on the street was that the neighborhood was being taken over by white people, yuppies and new media professionals who would pay exorbitant rents to reside in what the Utne Reader had called, quote, one of the trendiest places to live in America. And there was nothing, absolutely nothing that people of color could do. Some were going to housing court in hopes of saving lost leases, but most attempts to fight greedy landlords were unsuccessful. The neighborhood folks, many of whom had protested in the 1980s against the Contras in Nicaragua, were now feeling helpless. They were tired of fighting or simply unsure of how to protect themselves. They had seen their neighbors wage unsuccessful battles against landlords, and they were just hoping that they wouldn't be next. The streets were now lined with Land Rovers and BMWs, and once seedy neighborhood bars now employed bouncers and served overpriced raspberry martinis. Abandoned warehouses had not been converted into affordable housing, but instead into fancy lofts going for $300,000. Oh my gosh, this was 18 years ago, for going for $300,000 to $1 million. Does this sound familiar to anyone out there? The Army Street projects, which were in San Francisco, had been demolished, leaving thousands of people, many of them women with children, displaced and homeless. The message was clear. It was time for blacks and browns to get out. The whites were moving in, and that was it. For poor single mothers, like my mother, gentrification is a tactic the system uses to keep them down. It falls into the same category as workfare and minimum wage. Gentrification is a woman's issue, an economic issue, and most of all, a race issue. At my roots, I'm a womanist, as I believe in economic and social equality for all women. When I watch what has happened in my old neighborhood, I get angry because gentrification, like this, is a personal attack on any woman of color who is poor, working class, and trying to find an apartment in a real estate market that doesn't give a damn about single mothers, grandmothers raising crack babies, or women who speak English as a second language. The shameful thing is that yuppies have changed the fabric of a neighborhood that was, by all accounts, affordable and a great place to live. The Mission wasn't one of those neighborhoods destroyed by the 1980s crack epidemic. It wasn't a destitute community with burned out buildings and shuttered up storefronts where gunshots rang out in the night. It was a cultural mecca where working class people of color took pride in the community. The colorful murals that decorated the walls of local buildings were a testament to the rich Latino artistry, and the numerous thriving marquetas and restaurants were living proof of a small yet growing, thriving business district. We had nightclubs, supermarkets, auto body shops, meat markets, florists, delis, clothing stores owned and operated by first and second generation Mexican Americans. For many immigrants, the mission was a break from the poverty that had surrounded them in their previous countries. Although the workdays were long and hard, most of my neighbors were grateful for job opportunities that came their way. At least here in the mission, there was a way to support one's family. Many of us existed in a microcosm where working for white people as cooks, housekeepers, nannies was a way of life. Many years later, I realized this type of work was actually part of a larger system in which poor people, once again, many of them women, did the low-level, low-paid work that no one else wanted to do. As a result of this system, most of us remained poor. Today, I see we were making the best of a difficult situation. Even now, we, me and the women that I grew up with, insist we would purchase homes and raise our children if in the mission if we had the financial means. Our memories of the neighborhood and the community are that good. The infiltration of our neighborhood by the wealthy and the privileged is heartbreaking. To act as if my home, where I grew up, was somewhere that needed to be cleaned up, something that needed to be taken back, is insulting. It is as if our new neighbors deny that our businesses, familiar relationships, and community ever really existed in the first place. Many of the white people who have moved into the mission see us in stereotypical terms, as immigrants, as people with thick accents and brown skin, as people who play loud music and collect welfare. In essence, they ignore who we really are. Our new neighbors can't see our homes that are impeccably kept, and that many of the Latino families here are headed by both a mother and a father. And although we barely scrape by at times, we go to work, we pay our bills. They want to believe that we are all on welfare, destined to become single moms, crack addicts, alcoholics. The truth is, however, that most of us, myself included, have proven them wrong. We learned well on Shotwell Street from our single moms and the other women. Tina is now a sheriff. Maricela is a police officer. She's a sergeant now. Sonia is a journalist at the San Francisco Chronicle, and I am a writer and producer. None of us grew up to be statistics. So now I'm going to fast forward in the piece to Brooklyn. I pay an exorbitant rent to live in a Brooklyn neighborhood. This was 17 years ago, by the way, where the amenities include an around-the-clock liquor store, a marijuana delivery service, illegal all-night gambling, and numerous buildings for Section 8 families and other people on welfare. My building is earmarked for upwardly mobile professionals and white people. Throughout the neighborhood, signs of revitalization are cropping up. White kids walk smugly down the street, sometimes riding rickety bikes or skateboards. Internet businesses are popping up alongside yoga studios. And I have a fully renovated apartment with super fast internet access. This was on Washington Avenue in Prospect Heights. I am on the cusp of revitalization, and although I have an amazing apartment in the midst of the hood, I am more than conscious of the fact that the low-income women around me may not be here for long. I'm sure that they look at me and other professionals moving in and wonder, what are they doing here? Do my low-income neighbors realize that the new buildings being put up like wildfire are not for people like them, but for people like me who can afford to pay inflated rents for renovated apartments in the hood? I am keenly aware of exactly what is happening, and I realize that neighborhoods don't have to be financially rich to be culturally vibrant, and that white people moving into poor neighborhoods do little good for the people who actually live there, who have already lived there. White people move into black neighborhoods, the police presence increases, cafes pop up, and neighborhood bodegas start ordering the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. You rarely see low-income housing built along million-dollar lofts or social service centers opening next to yoga studios. When I think about this, I am caught somewhere in the middle, because although I have the money to live in a neighborhood that is being gentrified, I still hear the words that my black real estate agent whispered to me. Just think of this as your own little castle in the hood. I don't want them to take over my San Francisco neighborhood, but 5,000 miles away in another state, in another community, I am on the front lines of gentrification, as a neighbor so politely put it. When I come home at night and I see people loitering in front of the building next door, I realize that I may have switched sides in this fight. When I dodge cracked glass and litter while walking my dog, I realize that this neighborhood really could use a facelift, and that the yoga center that just opened up on the corner is a welcome change from the abandoned building that it used to be. Parts of my neighborhood in Brooklyn are symbolic of what the media and sociologists say is wrong with the inner city. I live on a block where police don't arrest drug dealers who peddle crack in broad daylight, where young black men drive around in huge SUVs but barely speak grammatically correct English, where I see the same brothers every day standing on street corners doing absolutely nothing. They don't hustle or harass me, but politely say, "Hello, Ma," as if they've accepted me. I feel strained by my situation, uncomfortable. While I am intimately aware of what is happening to my new neighborhood, I feel powerless. I've been in Brooklyn long enough to know that although this is not the most savory neighborhood, it is a community where people feel connected, where old folks know each other, where neighbors still chat. But sometimes I feel like telling the young men on the corner, "Get the hell off the street. Don't you see life is passing you by? Don't you see that this is what they expect you to do? Don't you see that they are moving in? In a few years, you are going to have to get out." In my neighborhood, men shoot each other. The sidewalks are cracked, and many of the buildings are abandoned. And I've witnessed 2 drug raids from my bedroom window. When I come home at night, I put on my sweatpants, I walk my tiny dog on little streets, littered streets past tomboys in goose-down coats, doing each other's hair on the stoops of aging brownstones. When I see these girls, I remember my own childhood, and I think that they deserve more than this. They deserve a neighborhood that is clean and safe, that provides some hope, a place where they can learn that some dreams do come true, and that Prince Charming doesn't drive an expedition and sell weed to his friends. Walking the streets, I realize my neighbors and I are alike in many ways. We like the same foods and the same music, and most important, we are a group of African American people living together in a neighborhood that is on the verge of change. But in the end, we are also very different. If the rents go up, I will have options and they may not. They may have to move and I will get to stay. Although we look the same, we are different. We are connected by race, but remain separated by a slip of paper called a college degree. Our block, our hood, our neighborhood has become the next stop on the White Flight Express. Thank you. Thank you. It brings me great honor and pride to introduce a young journalist right here. I'll just say I was at a convention last week, the National Association of Black Journalists Convention, and I'm fired up, sis, by you all. The millennials get a bad rap, and I don't know if you're a millennial, but I'll say that I work in a newsroom every day, and we could not get the news on the air if it wasn't for the strength of the millennials who are technologically savvy and just know how to, like, get things done quickly. So Jamila is a journalist who writes about race and gender. Yes, and she is currently the race and justice reporter at Mother Jones. Yes. Her work has previously appeared in the Washington Post, Mike Color Lines, and the California Sunday Magazine. Give it up for Jamila, who lives in Brooklyn. Yes. Yeah.
A little tall. Hey, guys. So, like Taji, I also grew up in San Francisco. I know I'm really short. I wanted to be taller. And I grew up with this story of my life. I grew up with this idea that, you know, there are seminal things that happen in your life, usually like one moment that changes the trajectory of everything. So I'd grown up with this narrative of my life based on something that happened in my family, and then everything changed. And so this is the story of that moment. And it's called Say Her Name. Utopia showed up at our door in May. I was 22 years old, 1 year removed from college, and living with my mom in San Francisco while I interned for free for a local weekly newspaper. It was a weekend and it was sunny in San Francisco, which was rare, and our home felt heavy, which was not rare. May had always been a month of unofficial mourning for my mother and me. On April 27th, 1990, my 15-year-old sister, Tanisha, had been shot and killed. On May 5th, she was buried. Her tombstone, which my family could not afford to buy, was donated by the family-owned company that made it. 4 days later, on May 9th, Tanisha did not get to celebrate what would have been her 16th birthday. And 4 days after that, May 13th, was Mother's Day. Her murder was never solved. I was only 4 years old when Tanisha was killed, so I don't remember the details of that very bad month. But I have felt it all my life. I still feel it. Nowhere is that feeling more powerful than in the home we shared, the third story of a Victorian-style apartment in San Francisco. Whenever May rolled around, my mother oscillated between intense grief that would leave her bedridden and fits of rage. Even today, my sister's ghost is present. If you squint, you can still see the thumbtack holes where she once hung LL Cool J posters on the walls. Once, when I was no older than 8, I heard my mom rationalize in a way that only grief allows. She never wanted to move, she said, because she wanted my sister to be able to find us if she ever came home. But my sister did not come home. Utopia did. Every so often, my sister's world would show up. Often I sought it out. I have no firsthand recollection of her. I don't remember her voice, and I can barely make out her face without the help of a picture. Once, I was playing in the living room and found a book tucked away on a bookshelf. It was Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, and my sister's name was written inside. Right, I thought to myself. This must be the book that she was assigned at school before she died. Those discoveries would often gut me because it showed me firsthand how reckless a Black girl's death could be. 1 minute, you're doing homework. The next minute, you're dead. But I'd also think about all the questions I had that my sister would never be able to answer. Did she like the book? What book was her favorite? I didn't know, and she could never tell me, and I knew this was wrong. Every few years, I'd see a flyer laying on the dining room table that my mother had gotten from the San Francisco District Attorney's office, offering a reward for information about my sister's murder. The narrative in the crime bulletin read as follows. On April 27th, 1990, Tanisha Hardy, 15 years old, was shot and killed while walking with a friend south on Webster Street near Fulton. At least 2 shots were fired from the corner where a group of young men had gathered. Utopia, it turns out, was that friend, and she had come home to tell us her story. Once, when I was maybe 12 or 13, my mother made one of her annual calls to homicide investigators. She wanted to know what, if any, progress had been made in my sister's case. The detective who had originally investigated my sister's murder had been reassigned. My mother wanted to know who she could talk to in order to get answers. "I'm calling," I heard her say over the phone, "because my daughter was assassinated." At the time, I was fixated on learning about the Civil War. I knew what it meant to be assassinated. Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. John Wilkes Booth had crept up behind him, put a gun to his head, and pulled the trigger. What followed was one of the most consequential periods of American history. I knew then that only important people were assassinated. Their lives were matters of public consequence, and so too were their deaths. Black girls like my sister were not important. Her life was not a matter of public consequence, and neither was her death, according to the most common telling of stories like hers. She is not engraved in a statue complete with gold doorknocker earrings and a side ponytail. There are no national holidays dedicated to her legacy. There was only a block party that her friends organized in the courtyard of a neighborhood housing project, to which they wore matching jackets emblazoned with her nickname and the words, "Rest in peace." Left to grieve in private, my mother staged daily rebellions. I wasn't allowed to say the Pledge of Allegiance to a flag for a country that had such little regard for our lives and for our deaths. My mother would see a group of police officers out in the street, laughing, being carefree, and she would grow hot with anger. How dare they laugh when her child was dead and gone and no one had been held to account for it? She held the state responsible for my sister's unsolved homicide, but she held our community responsible for her death. Sure, the community had nurtured my sister's life, but it was also harboring the person who'd killed her. Even worse, Black America had turned in on itself and had begun to blame its children for their own demise. Mothers, Black mothers especially, were held responsible. Lines were drawn and enemies were everywhere. One of my mother's best childhood friends, a woman she'd grown up with, had left the city amid the carnage of the 1980s for the relative safety of the nearby suburbs. The city was dangerous, and so were the people in it. One day, decades later, this old friend made an offhand comment about my sister, lamenting her death. "The streets took her," she told my mother. These were the lies we were taught to believe about our children by our lawmakers and our police officers and our movies and even ourselves, that they were in some way responsible for their own murders, that seemingly simple transgressions, seen as rites of passage in white communities, cutting school, smoking weed, walking the streets after dark with a friend, had suddenly morphed into crimes for which Black children were tried without a judge or jury. Black childhood was itself criminal and punishable by death, and we, Black people, were powerless to stop it, the story went. My mother refused to internalize this narrative because she knew her daughter and she knew herself. "The streets didn't take my child," she told her friend. "A man with a gun did." My mother isn't the only one who's engaged in this type of resistance. It's now coalesced in the social media movement, Say Her Name, which counters the attention given to the extrajudicial killings of Black men and boys with a call to also amplify the stories of Black women and girls who were murdered. Kimberly Crenshaw, the legal scholar who coined the term intersectionality, would later release a series of reports through her African American Policy Forum unpacking all of the institutional forces that put Black women's lives at risk, including outsized punishment in schools and unwarranted government security in housing and child rearing. It's these forces that, too often, prove deadly for Black women. And the call to say their names is a direct challenge to acknowledge their humanity and the unique dreams and experiences they had. So, to figure out how this story ends, you have to buy the book. I encourage you to do all of that. And so before I leave the stage, huge thank you to Bushra and Daisy for inviting me to do this. I used to carry the first edition of this book around with me in college like a Bible. And actually, Daisy, I don't know if you remember this, but after I read it, I was like, oh, cool, she's a journalist. I might want to do that. And so I emailed you, and I was like, hey, can I talk to you about journalism? And you were like, sure. And you talked to me about journalism, and that was really great. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. So I have the great honor of introducing our final reader for the night. Andrea L. Pino Silva is, first of all, a close personal friend of Lady Gaga, I hear. But she's the co-author of We Believe You, Survivors of Campus Sexual Assault Speak Out, and co-founder of the National Survivor Advocacy Organization and Rape on Campus. She attended the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, go Tar Heels, as a first-generation college student, and was among the first survivors of campus sexual assault to publicly file a federal Title IX complaint. Her activism and personal journey is prominently featured in the 2015 Sundance film The Hunting Ground, and she appeared alongside Lady Gaga and 50 other survivors at the 2016 Academy Awards.
I'm really glad we're the same height, so we don't have to keep doing this whole adjustment process. So first of all, thank you so much to Bushra and Daisy. I mean, for so many reasons, I also carried around Colonize This like it was a Bible, especially when I was like distraught about feminism even representing me. Colonize This reminded me that I was part of the movement. So thank you so much for putting that book together. I mean, when I was like literally, what, like 10 years old? So thank you. So before I start, a disclaimer, I am a slow-speaking Cuban, believe it or not. This is just how we are, so I apologize. And the second thing is I will discuss sexual assault, not explicitly, but if at any point this is triggering for you, I am not offended if you decide to leave. So thank you for coming out here. So my essay is actually called Our Hermanitas Heroes. Another thing, too, is I will go in and out of Spanish, so brush up on those lessons you had in elementary school. So anyway, thank you so much for coming. It was February 28th, 2016, and I stood backstage at the Dolby Theater waiting to step in front of this year's Academy Award nominees. I was surrounded by a crew of 50 people who to an onlooker had nothing in common. Visibly queer bodies, a Texas Republican, a CEO of a corporation, a Harvard law grad, a tenor at the National Cathedral, and more black and brown folks that there likely had ever been on an Oscar stage, let's be real. Some of them were nervous, some excited to be in the presence of their lifelong heroes. I felt love. We were so different. But as the stage lights burned on our faces, as we began to hear Lady Gaga's words echo in the room, our fingers enlaced and we walked forward to face the world as survivors of sexual assault. We were invincible. I was 24 at the time. Women my age and older called me their hero. What did it mean for me to be a hero? What did it mean to be a hero when I had not always been myself on this journey? When parts of my story had been edited out parts of my story had been edited out for my activism by white feminism. Every morning before school, my abuelito and my hermanita waited for me in his 1989 Toyota Corolla, honking every 5 minutes to remind me that we would be late, as usual. I locked myself in our only bathroom, desperate, trying to gel that untamable frizz around my face that prevented my hair from ever being properly contained. Complementing this mess was the ever-present middle button of my white blouse that would never close, thanks to my inflating chest. Nothing contained the marimacha in the mirror, and certainly not the constraints of a Catholic school romper. There was never a time I didn't struggle to balance my need for belonging and my insatiable need to question everything. I was never happy sitting in the class and repeating oraciones, and when we had to go to confession, I never felt the need to apologize for missing yet another misa that Sunday when I had an important episode of Sailor Moon to watch. I didn't really let myself process my queerness at the time, but probably looking back, I knew that I didn't want to be Sailor Jupiter as much as date her. As a niña, I was starving for images of heroes, of mujeres who were free to ask questions without limitation. I had seen glimpses of these heroes in movies and books and in video games even, but they weren't Cuban and they weren't marimachas and they weren't sitting alone in a bathroom dressed in a Catholic school uniform questioning if they felt more trapped in a skirt or in their own community. I would spend years straightening my hair and my body, learning how to speak like the Americanas on television, pretending to like that boy, the one who seemed the least unbearable, and questioning if my ideas and accomplishments truly deserved merit. I wish I could say that I found that sense of belonging when I first sat down in the back of my Women's Studies 101 lecture in college. I hesitated then, just as I had when I had been a niña, to look around me and search for other mujeres like me who long for the tenderness and nurture of comunidad. It was 2013, before these same peers posted Me Too, before feminism was the word of the year and sexual assault survivors adorned the Time cover for Person of the Year. I approached my white women's studies professor about struggling to complete my assignments when I was overcoming my duty to combat campus sexual violence. In her office, surrounded by the smell of books that I had devoured well before taking Women's Studies 101, when I was most starved for a community, most alone in my pain and my rawness, so soon after assault, my professor told me that I didn't understand feminism and that perhaps I should take time off. That was the last Women's Studies class I ever took. There were times when I believed that being a hero meant I had a duty to publicly relive my rape in detail. At the same time, I could never make mistakes in my storytelling because lives depended on me to be a perfect victim. At other times in my activism to end sexual assault, I have been the sole voice of color in a classroom, on a panel, or in a nonprofit organization. And I have had the white women tell me that I speak too fast, too passionately, and too angrily. Just like in high school, I have felt the need to be more acceptable. I've had to add an extra layer of foundation to my face and spoken extra slowly or sat in silence. How could I be a hero when there were times that I felt like I didn't want to be alive anymore? When I found myself fixed to a hospital bed, needles digging into the veins on the backs of my hands, liquids flowing in, struggling to circulate life into the shell of a body that would rather die than face the shame of others knowing that even with all that I have accomplished, survivorhood can still look like this. I once felt that to be a feminist, to be a hero, I had to pass as a white woman, as a straight woman, as an able-bodied woman. Sometimes I believe there isn't a place for my real voice in feminism. Sometimes I feel that the work I do isn't enough, when there are dreamers, beautiful, questioning queer Latinas, and young survivors who won't ever pick up this book because they are trying to survive, luchando to pay their bills instead of taking that unpaid internship at an organization run by some white feminists who memorized the word intersectionality for Women's Studies 101, but never thought that it was important enough to write into their organizational bylaws. Trying to pass like I live in a world that only wants our stories during every election, production, or fundraising cycle. But now I am done letting them take my voice. White feminism, our stories and our bodies don't belong to you, but our spaces, your spaces will one day belong to us. My younger hermanita Angie has always seen me as her Wonder Woman. We are 2 years apart, 2.37 months to be exact, as she always reminds us, and it's hard to imagine how things were before we were together. In Catholic school one time, an older kid pushed her to the ground to cut in front of her at the water fountain, but I saw him, ran to her side, and hit him with my oversized rolling backpack, all the rage in the 90s. In other words, I have never questioned that fighting for what was right was worth the cost, especially if that fight meant making the world safer for my hermanita. I paused on college so I could stop rape on college campuses in this country. It took me 7 years to finish my college degree, and that meant my hermanita became the first person in our family to graduate from college. Because of the mujeres who came before me and the mujeres who worked alongside me, things are better for her, and that makes all the difference. The mujeres in my family have always been my heroes. In addition to my abuela Eva, there is my abuela Puchi, who supported my father and uncle as a single mother, as a refugee when the Castro regime imprisoned her husband. Mommy has been the breadwinner our entire life, leaving her first year of college to support our family when my abuela had a heart attack. She's held the same office job since 1990, and I wonder if she thinks about what life would be like if she didn't need to be our hero. Orgullo doesn't begin to describe how my family feels about me, how proud my abuela was to display my graduation photos and my photo with President Obama on the coffee table at the entryway to his house. They believe in me now as they did when I was a niña, even if they don't know how to talk to me about where my journey has taken me. To them, I am la mujer they've always dreamed of, their hero.
Thank you so, so much. Thank you so much to all the beautiful writers. Thank you to all of you for coming. And I want a round of applause for the Asian American Writers Workshop. Thank you for giving us a space to share all of these incredible stories and to celebrate this new edition.
And we will have many more events, but for now, I'm so excited that there are more original contributors in the audience. We have Erica right here. Is Kini here? Kini? Shani? Shani? Kini? Where are you, Kini? Oh, Kini! We want to have more events with the original contributors and the new contributors. Honestly, rereading the old essays, working with all of the new contributors, it really got us through these last 2 years, I have to say. And one thing I kept thinking is that we live in more disturbing times than 20 years ago, even though it was 9/11 20 years ago, almost 17 years ago. But the activism we're seeing now is also so much stronger and so much more inspiring, and that's why we're so happy that you're all here. That's it. We have the space until 10. Reka's gonna DJ, have some dumplings, get your book signed by the different contributors, say hello. And also there's so many amazing activists here. So introduce yourselves, learn about organizations. There's someone here from Stand Up for Kashmir, who if you raise your hand, you can also talk to Samia over here. But there are people from every possible amazing activist group you could think of. Introduce yourselves and get involved. Okay, thank you.